I know, you've probably been wondering all week long, but how did Universalists come to this country? How did it get started?
I've been wondering that.
I know, burning with curiosity. Well, good news. Today we have one miraculous true story about John Murray. Now, a person never knows for sure about the wind, where it comes from, what it blows in, what it takes away, and how suddenly it can just change directions and it can turn a life upside down. And that is what happened to John Murray. Unpredictable winds kept blowing and reshaping his life. First, the winds of good fortune provided John Murray, who was a young Englishman, with a very nice life. He had a fine education, a steady job, a loving wife, and a beautiful young son. Life was sweet. But without warning, an ill wind blew into John Murray's life, and everything changed. John's wife and his son grew gravely ill and died. He lost his job, his possessions, and then he was landed in jail because he was unable to pay his bills. Until that tragic time, John had been a religious man, a Universalist, in fact, who preached the good news of a loving God. But after losing everything that mattered to him, he fell into a deep depression. He was no longer certain about what he believed. He felt if all meaning and purpose had gone out of his life. Now, in times like this, and John was fortunate, caring friends continued to love him and convinced him to keep going and to leave England and to find a new home and a new place where he could begin again. And so, on July 21st in 1770, John Murray set sail for America on a ship called the Hand in Hand. Now, a wholesome wind blew the Hand in Hand and all its passengers towards its destination of New York City. But as the ship neared the coastline, a heavy, dense fog rolled in, and no one could see the coastline. Everyone on the Hand in Hand was very worried about crashing, and so they slowed down and drifted south, finally running aground in New Jersey, at a place called Good Luck Point. Now, John and some of the other passengers set ashore for directions and to gather supplies after the long journey, and as he made his way on land, John encountered a farmhouse with all things next to it, a chapel. That farm belonged to a man named Thomas Potter, and Thomas ran out to greet them, and he offered them food for the people there and everyone on the ship. And he also looked at John curiously and then invited him to come back that night for dinner. Now, Thomas Potter, he was a very humble farmer who had a big dream of a church where a trusting, loving, inclusive religion would be preached. Now, Thomas could not read, but he could build, so he built a chapel. And he had a dream that someday someone would preach this good news in his little chapel. This news of astounding love, of a love that would nourish every person and triumph over every circumstance. At dinner that evening, Thomas greeted John with these words: "Come, my friend, I am glad you have returned. I have longed to see you. I have been expecting you for a long time." And before dinner, Thomas showed John that chapel, and he told him how he had built the chapel for a particular kind of minister to arrive. Thomas told John that he had a dream of how his chapel would be a place of truth and loving and inclusive religion, a religion without judgment, without damnation. Now, what do we call that religion? Universalism. Oh, good, you're following along. I just want to make sure. So John then confessed to Thomas that he, too, had once been a Universalist. "John," said Thomas, "you are the minister. You are that minister." But John, he did not want to hear this. He was not a preacher anymore, and he promised himself he would never, ever preach again or return to religion. Maybe some of you had that experience. He had endured terrible pain, and he was heartbroken, and he just did not want to go back. But Thomas felt in his heart, he was certain that John Murray was the person he'd been waiting for, so he begged John to preach that Sunday. John finally said, I can't preach, because as soon as that wind changes, my boat will sail and I will be on it. Well, said Thomas, if for some reason the boat doesn't set sail on Sunday or before Sunday, will you preach? Fine, John said. I am still here on Sunday. I will preach. Well, you might have guessed. The wind did not blow, and the hand in hand did not set sail. And on Sunday, September 30th, 1770, that's 253 years ago yesterday, John Murray preached in Thomas Potter's chapel a message of universal love, a love wholly and ultimately available to all people everywhere. The winds of change that had brought John Murray to church that Sunday morning, he was overcome by them. And that experience and that sense of hope returned to him once more. And he realized after preaching that all he really wanted to do was preach universalism more than anything else in the world. And so he did for many, many years. And John Murray today is known as one of the founders of Universalism in America. And so today, we offer gratitude to the wind of change, the wind that blew in the hand in hand and had it land at Good Luck Point, and the one that would not blow John Murray away before changing his life and all of our lives with the power of hope and the message of a transformative power of love. The end.
What a beautiful true story. Good Luck, New Jersey. Well, we're going to enter into a time of meditation, followed by shared silence, followed by singing hymn 123, Spirit of Life, while we're seated. So I just invite you to get settled where you are, however that works for you. I know I usually need to just kind of wiggle my body a little bit, so you can wiggle your body a little bit if you want, and then gradually bring your attention to your breathing and see if you can maybe breathe from deep, deep down in your belly. And then let your gaze soften. And if you want to, you can close your eyes, whatever you're comfortable with. To invoke love, wrote the Reverend Sean Parker Dennison, is to give up self-deprecation, false humility, pride, and to consider yourself worthy to be made whole, willing to encounter love that will never let us let each other go. To invoke love is to guard against assumptions. Take care with our words and practice forgiveness, not as ethereal ideal, but right here in the messy midst of our imperfect lives. To invoke love is to approach each day and every person with wonder, anticipating love's arrival. Is this the moment? Is this love's grand entrance? Is this person the embodiment of love? Am I the one?
Good morning, First Church. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee. I'm Eric Alexander, and I am amped up this morning to serve as your worship associate. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all you are carrying with you today and all your heart longs to set down. We welcome all the people watching online. Our yearly evacuation today, go outside, come back in. No, there will still be coffee and conversation. So we look forward to seeing you then. Some accessibility notes. You can find hearing assist devices and large print hymnals and orders of service at the back of the sanctuary, as well as worship activity bags for children and anyone who wants them. There's a fragrance-free area in the front right pews. If you're watching online, you can enable YouTube's closed captioning on your viewing device. We have a few announcements this morning. Our fall Journey to Membership class starts next weekend. Sign up at the membership table during coffee hour if you are considering joining the community, or if you just want to meet other newcomers, staff, and learn more about the church and Unitarian Universalist. The Feast for Funds auction crew will also be in coffee hour through October 22nd. They'll have donation forms and lots of brainstorming energy. Visit them today and help bring our favorite fundraiser back. First graders through adults are invited to join in singing the Garden Song, aka Inch by Inch, Row by Row, as our prelude for Sunday services on October 15th. If you and your children would like to participate, please email Alyssa Rohde. I welcome you to join in our First Church worship and purpose by inviting you to join me in a unison affirmation of our mission that is printed in your order of service, and we're going to bring some first day of October energy to this. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. I like it, thank you. Every week we have an opportunity to practice our values through sharing our resources. Our pledges are at the core of our spiritual practice of generosity. In addition, the church shares half of all non-pledged cash in our offering plate with a community organization, practicing our value of interdependence. Today we shared a plate with Kinship Community Food Center. Kinship Community Food Center engages volunteers and neighborhood residents to end hunger, isolation, and poverty. Their innovative programs nourish food security and wellness, foster belonging and community engagement, and empower stability and economic prosperity in our city. May the practice of giving bring us joy. The offering will now be gratefully received as we stay seated and sing our children's recessional hymn. I invite all children, youth, and RE volunteers to sing the first verse of the hymn, and then follow Reverend Kimberly to the Lee House Common Room, and then downstairs for religious education. If your child needs to check in for RE, please accompany them to the Common Room now. We will now sing hymn number 212, We Are Dancing Sarah's Circle. I am a coward. Not when it comes to taking risks or protecting my loved ones, but I will do most anything to avoid interpersonal awkwardness. So it wasn't a necessary question for me to ask as his physician. It was with significant difficulty that I summoned the courage to ask my patient, "What are you in for?" As I continued to surgically remove his skin cancer, my jumpsuited and shackled patient told me and the armed guard in the room about the bar fight that cost him his freedom. He was a nice, friendly guy, albeit one who had made a colossal error. At one point, he asked me, "You know that feeling when the police have you face down on the ground and they put their knee on your back?" Since it was before the murder of George Floyd, I laughed quietly and honestly replied, "No, I don't know that feeling." We clearly led very different lives, but circumstance brought us together in this operating theater where we connected on a human level. Many of my colleagues won't see prisoners. They worry about the inmates themselves, as well as what other patients in the office might think about the optics. I actually welcome it when another patient questions me about seeing incarcerated people because it gives me a chance to share my values. I tell them that the criminal justice system has, for better or worse, chosen to take away this person's liberty. That is their punishment. It is not up to me or anyone else to penalize them further. Despite their criminal conviction, they still have inherent worth and dignity as humans. I see the exam room as a quasi-sacred space of trust and healing. This feeling crystallized one day during my training when I saw a patient whose appearance resembled the Batman villain Two-Face. Unfortunately, large sections of the left side of his face were missing. I immediately recalled the news stories and realized that this was the man who had shot and killed his wife before shooting and unsuccessfully tried to kill himself. Yet I had no problem immediately compartmentalizing that fact and treating him as I would any other patient. He was still a living person, deserving of my love and 100% of my skill to alleviate his suffering. It was actually more challenging when I received a phone call one late October day asking me if I could work in a politician whose policies I found particularly odious. I agreed on the condition that there were no obtrusive security requirements. No, they said, just one armed guard. Just like a prisoner, I thought. Like many UUs, I tried to separate a person's humanness from their ideas and actions to see their inherent worth and dignity. But when someone advocates for putting so much hate and pain into the world, I do struggle. But I mean, I've cared for murderers, rapists, all kinds of people who've committed atrocious acts. Surely I could treat someone from across the aisle. Thankfully, my values and ability to compartmentalize took over when I entered the exam room. I treated this person as I would any other patient, explained what was happening, laid out the options and potential next steps, and then we settled on a treatment course that was almost instantaneously successful. I chose love, even if experience suggested that the person across from me wouldn't have been so generous. Walking home, I reflected on the experience while realizing that I was passing the municipal building. A beautifully karmic idea arose. I went in and voted early for my patient's opponent. I successfully lived my values in the exam room that afternoon, then chose love again, this time at the ballot box.
when I was serving in my first settlement as a new minister in a rural area of New England, I had occasion to visit a regular guest of the congregation who was incarcerated in the local correctional facility. I didn't want to go. I had never been inside a jail, and I knew I would get claustrophobic. Everything about this opportunity for ministry was scary to me in its unknown. The congregant was young, newly coming out as transgender, estranged from their family, with no one except their partner to visit them. I had to find the courage to go. I didn't have a clergy collar back then to proclaim my role, but I had my UU values rooted in our Jewish and Christian heritage. I had quoted that scripture from the pulpit where Jesus says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." The pastoral imperative couldn't have been clearer. Love was calling. So I went. As each door clanged heavily and locked behind me, I felt my anxiety rise. But when the visit began, in a large, fluorescently lighted room, supervised from a high window, I found that the walls were not pressing in. What I experienced instead was an opening into the sacred circle of confidentiality and care, which held both of us in hope. Well, that was then, and this is now, but the way that love calls us into spaces and places and relationships that are unknown continues. I wonder, where is love calling you? In our Unitarian Universalist covenant, it says we draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. What have we inherited from our past? How do we weave the gifts of the past into the present, building on the foundation of love? Our rich UU heritage evolved over the decades and centuries by building on the foundation each generation inherited. Not without struggle and conflict, not without argument and sacrifice, but also not without joy. You may or may not be aware that the Unitarians and the Universalists were separate religious movements for most of our history, albeit with much in common. The Universalist core values were hope and courage. The Unitarians' core values were freedom and reason. When we search for the UU building blocks, far back into the debates over early Christian doctrine, we find the theologian Arius of Alexandria, Egypt, who argued in the 4th century for the freedom to believe that Jesus was human and maybe partly divine, but not fully divine, not the same as God. We also find the theologian Origen of Alexandria, who argued for universal salvation in the 3rd century. As you may know, Origen and Arius lost those debates. Their beliefs were decreed heresies, and their people heretics. but the word heretic simply means one who chooses. Freedom to choose is the bedrock of our UU foundation. First Church's Minister Emeritus, Drew Kennedy, used to teach our new members about UU history using the metaphor of drawing the circle wider after each major controversy resolved. So, I'm taking from his notes a little bit here. The Unitarian controversy raged from 1815 to 1819 in New England, resulting in the emergence of Unitarianism as a separate denomination from the Congregationalists. The Orthodox Congregationists and the Liberal Congregationalists argued about contrasting beliefs: a stern, judgmental God versus a loving God, human nature as depraved versus human nature as good, and whether the Bible proclaimed the Trinity or the unity of God. As is often the case during controversy, a spokesperson emerges. William Ellery Channing was the spokesperson for Unitarianism when he preached a very long sermon called Unitarian Christianity in 1819 at a new colleague's ordination ceremony. Channing's sermon spelled out the theological foundation of Unitarianism and drew the circle wide for liberal Congregationalists to claim themselves Unitarian. Fairly soon, building on this freedom of thought, these new Unitarians were challenged from within. During the Transcendentalist controversy, they were challenged by Transcendentalist leaders Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Theodore Parker. The Transcendentalist controversy of the 1830s and 40s debated whether Christianity was truly a superior religion. The Transcendentalists emphasized direct experience of the divine through human intuition and encounters in nature. There were heated arguments and pamphlet wars, which, for those of you who have never seen a pamphlet, it's like a blog or a long Instapost on paper. Theodore Parker delivered a very long sermon in 1841 called The Transient and Permanent in Christianity. The gall of it, that anything could be called transient, impermanent in Christianity. Well, he suffered for that. Afterwards, Parker's Unitarian colleagues refused to exchange pulpits with him, which was a deeply felt censure of his views. Would the Transcendentalists be tolerated? Eventually, yes, the Unitarians drew the circle wider in allegiance to the foundation of the free mind. An interesting detail, Parker's sermon was in 1841 out east. Our congregation was founded in 1842 here in Milwaukee. Well, then came the issue in the West, which really was the Midwest as we know it, in the 1870s to 1895. It was Team Unitarian Christian versus Team Unitarian Theist. Whew! I know, but it was a heated argument. The Unitarian Christians could not imagine their religion without centering Jesus, while the Unitarian Theists argued that liberal religion could include those who believed in God, but did not center Jesus. Again, pamphlet and pulpit wars until our movement drew the circle wide to include both sides, building on the foundation of the free mind. Then, of course, came another debate, because that is what we like to do. We have ideas. We argue the humanist theist debate of 1913 to 1933, led by John Dietrich of Minneapolis. The debate between God versus no God was no less heated, as you can imagine. Could someone be a Unitarian if they did not believe in God. Several pamphlet and pulpit wars later, the answer was yes. Building on the foundation of the free mind, our forebears drew the circle wider still. Well, how did the Unitarians and the Universalists eventually get together? The youth led the way. When the youth groups in each movement got together in the 1950s, united in their similarities, they challenged the adults to consider merging denominations. But, as we know, adults are slower to change. And there were power dynamics in play. Painting in broad historical strokes, Universalists in the United States were primarily farmers and laborers, working class people. Unitarians were from the elite, landowners, business owners, lawyers, doctors, professors. With the emphasis on individual freedom and reason from the Unitarians, along with their class power and privilege, trample on the core values of universal love, hope, and courage of the Universalists. It took many conversations, but eventually, in 1960, when I was born, the Unitarians and Universalists came together, well, first separately in Boston, the Holy Land, and each group voted overwhelmingly for consolidation. The delegates present on that historic occasion said the emotional climax came as the two groups joined together after the votes for worship, as they collectively streamed into the sanctuary as a new uniting body. They sang the hymn, "As tranquil streams that meet and merge," over and over until everyone was joined together in the same room. And that consolidation was formalized in 1961. Well, the 1960s was a tumultuous time, as we know. UUs were supportive of civil rights, but had trouble living out the core value of love on the institutional level. The Black empowerment controversy of 1967 to 1970 engaged the conflict between integrationist UUs and Black caucus approaches to racial justice work. Set in the cauldron of urban uprisings filled with people frustrated that civil rights legislation had not alleviated African American poverty, and the grief and rage after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Black empowerment and Unitarian Universalism clashed with the slow pace of our majority white institutionalists who were more concerned about proper democratic process at the UUA. Funding was promised from the UUA to the Black Affairs Council of UUs, but then it was reduced significantly when the UUA was facing a budget deficit. It was a slap in the face, deeply discouraging, and felt as a betrayal by many. The 1970s brought controversy over gender-inclusive language and women's rights in our movement, culminating in the 1977 Women and Religion Resolution, led by lay leader Lucille Shook Longview. This widely involved process opened the door for many women to become ordained UU ministers, breaking the stained glass ceiling. The Women and Religion Resolution also called for an extensive rewrite of our UU principles, our consolidating principles, this was just 20 years after the UUA formed, so that there would be gender-inclusive language, so that the circle would be drawn wider for justice. And that resulted in the principles that we have been proclaiming since the 1980s, our 7 principles. 40 years later, here we are, and UUs are currently debating, because that is what we like to do, another update to our principles and purposes called Article 2 of our UUA bylaws. Article 2 is still in flux, but as of June 2023 General Assembly, the draft states, the purpose of the UUA is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. Friends, we know that drawing the circle wide with love at the center is the work of many generations, fraught with conflict and controversy, and we know that it does not always end well. Universalist Abner Neeland, for example, was a pantheist, believed that the divine was in every person and every place and all of nature, was tried on charges of blasphemy by his own people, by the Boston religious establishment in the 1830s, when his beliefs were interpreted as gas atheism. He was convicted, his 3 appeals denied, and served 60 days in jail in 1838. Then there was the Reverend William Jackson, an African American who converted to Unitarianism in 1860, was not welcomed at the fall convention of the American Unitarian Association. UU Minister Mark Morrison Reed wrote in his book, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in UUism. He wrote, on Thursday, October 11, 1860, a key incident of Unitarian history occurred in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The AUA was holding its annual autumnal convention there, discussing, among other topics, how the AUA might spread the good news about Unitarianism to more people. On the last morning of the 3-day convention, African American minister William Jackson stood and addressed the convention. There he stood, a distinguished-looking man of 42 years of age, an experienced minister, an African American man addressing a sea of white faces. He was about to tell these white Unitarians that he was one of them. He had converted to Unitarianism. The New Bedford Evening Standard News reported, Reverend Mr. Jackson, pastor of Salem Baptist Church of this city, addressed the convention, saying that he subscribed entirely to the doctrines advanced in the discourses which had been delivered before the body. He avowed himself as a convert to the doctrines of liberal Christianity and should endeavor in the future to advocate those sentiments from his pulpit. The Reverend Mr. William J. Potter of this city bore testimony to the character and integrity of Mr. Jackson. He suggested that a collection be taken up in aid of Mr. Jackson's church, which was somewhat in debt. Morrison Reed continues, there was no discussion, there was no welcome, there was no expression of praise and satisfaction that the Unitarian gospel had reached the colored, as that term was used back then. The Unitarians took up a collection and Mr. Jackson was sent on his way. And shocking though it may be to us now, not all Unitarians or Universalists were in favor of abolition in the 1860s. Including some members of our congregation. When First Unitarian Society Milwaukee's minister, our minister, the Reverend Nahor Augustus Staple, preached his fiery anti-slavery sermon on Thanksgiving Day in 1859, some of our members resigned afterwards. Many Black UUs left our movement in the wake of the Black empowerment controversy, a century and a decade later. feeling betrayed by unfulfilled promises. We know today that our individual beliefs are woven tightly into our identities, and it can be challenging to keep drawing the circle wide with love at the center in the service of community. And yet that is what love is calling us to do. I imagine you may want to know what happened to the incarcerated church guests that I visited in New England many years ago. After they served their time and returned to community, they became a member of the congregation I served. It was hard for the rest of the church to embrace them and their partner, to relate authentically across difference. People were uncomfortable, worried about their presence upsetting other members and future guests. They were worried about the optics, as Eric said in his Worship Associate story. This dynamic reminded me of the cliquishness of high school. I know this is challenging, I said to the lay leaders. I know you're uncomfortable, I get it. But we are called to something larger than ourselves. I said to the congregation, we are called to choose love, pointing at the welcoming congregation poster on the wall in the foyer again and again and again. I get it, but we are called to something larger than ourselves. Opening our arms to this couple was not easy. They had a lot of needs, only some of which could be met. But at my goodbye party, after serving that congregation for 10 years, this returning citizen stood to thank me, tears running down her face, and said, Dina, you visited me in prison when no one else came. There are times when we are called to widen the circle of love, to draw that circle wider in our personal lives, our professional lives, in our congregational life, in our movement as Unitarian Universalists. And we are not alone in this. Our rich UU heritage has evolved over the decades and the centuries by building on love, building on the foundation that we inherited, calling us to transform and heal the mistakes of our forebears, calling us into the unknown. We continue to build upon love, not without struggle and conflict, not without debate, because that is what we do, not without argument and even sacrifice, but also not without joy. May it be so. Our closing words, again, to invoke love, wrote the Reverend Sean Parker Dennison, is to play the fool, the one more concerned with loving than with appearance or reputation, the one ready and willing to be vulnerable, abandoning anything that gets in love's way. To invoke love is to be ready to become love. Here, now, in everything we do. Are you ready? And the congregation said, yes! You know, new order of service, we're getting used to it. We are, unfortunately, not going to sing the historic recessional hymn, As Tranquil Streams That Meet and Merge, today, because we have our annual all-church emergency evacuation drill. Yay! So I'm going to give you instructions. Here's what we are going to do at the end of the instructions when I say go. We are going to evacuate all floors of this building, including religious education and the nursery, and we need to